my name is Daragh Murray. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Essex Human Rights Centre, and I'm joined by Prof. Yvonne McDermott, who's a professor at Swansea University, and Prof. Alexa Koenig, who's a prof at UC Berkeley in California. Today, we're going to talk about open source investigations, and particularly some of the issues that arise when conducting investigations in terms of potential blind spots or gaps in the investigations. Before we get into that and maybe in more detail, maybe one of you could talk us through what open source investigations are. I have to apologize too. Normally I record podcasts without video, so I've just realized I'm really fidgety.
So in a nutshell, online open source investigations would, of course, be any type of investigation that uses online information that's publicly accessible. Generally, in looking at some of the definitions that are emerging right now, it would include anything that the public can access by request, so asking for access, when that access will be broadly given, by possibly paying a very nominal amount. So I think and I think that's one gets a little bit fuzzy, because if you do have to pay quite a bit, we wouldn't necessarily consider that publicly accessible, versus smaller amounts would make sense. I think we really wanted to include ideas like journal articles that you could get for a nominal cost in that broader bucket. And then, of course, by observation, which I think is the main bucket of information that we're going after, which is you get on your web browser and you put in some search terms and you see what pops up, or you have a URL and you go directly to that site and you see what you can get and what kind of information you can pull out that might be helpful to your investigation. But that public piece of it, I think, is very, very important.
Yeah, I guess like we've all been working on open source investigations for the last couple of years, and it's kind of always been in its silo to a degree, you know, in the human rights community. But we're recording this on the 11th of February 2021, and I think it's a really dramatic example of the power of open source information in terms of the information that's been used at the current the impeachment process against President Trump, you know, where it's a very dramatic, this is a huge volume of open source information that is giving like really exceptional insights. Yvonne, what do you think the key benefits associated with open source information are?
So I think there are a couple. I think, first of all, I'm just following up on the point you just made about how we see it in the impeachment proceedings. And I think we also see it more and more in international courts. And this is something Alexa's been working on for years. But, you know, if we look at the ICC, there have been cases where satellite imagery has been used to show the destruction of cultural property, where information from Facebook has been put forward to show networks of people. So we can see this kind of information really becoming central to international prosecutions. So what are the benefits? Several. So first is it's cheaper than going to a site and trying to find witnesses to speak to things that they've observed. Secondly, potentially it gives voice to a wider range of people. So there's been an awful lot written about how traditionally, you know, you have these gatekeepers, and who investigators get to speak to or get to hear from can often be mediated by who they're given access to on the ground. Whereas potentially anyone can pick up their mobile phone, they can take a video and they can post it to Twitter or YouTube or Facebook, and potentially that evidence can be used by human rights investigators. Yeah, so I think those are two big benefits. There's also, you know, I suppose there have been a lot of well-documented issues around witness testimony, and, you know, witnesses can sometimes forget things, or their memories may not be the most reliable, or they, you know, sometimes witnesses lie, and that's just a fact of criminal trials in any jurisdiction, or civil trials for that matter. So something that's put forward is this idea of it being relatively objective. And we can talk a little bit about, you know, how far we can take
relatively.
but to some extent, you know, if you can geolocate something on a map, it's quite hard to sort of argue against that, compared to if someone tells you, yes, no, this was on Main Street in this town or this place.
Yeah. And so those are all like, well, I think very big advantages. But we're here today, I suppose, to talk about the problems or the gaps. Alexa, how did you start thinking about these? You know, like what were the prompts, I guess, that made you think like, oh, this is something we need to research?
You know, I think just learning more and more about how humans interface with technology was a big piece of this. My background is as a sociologist, and so thinking about this interplay between machines and humans has been kind of given a lot of food for thought about whose voices are even present in these online spaces that we're investigating. What does it mean to have access to the internet? How does that really vary in different jurisdictions around the world? So of course, we know that there can be really large differentials about who has access to smartphones, who might be capturing this information, what perspectives they have on conflict or violence, and how they get that out to the world. Even just having children and seeing how my daughter may live on TikTok while I may be living on Twitter, while my mom might be living on Facebook. And thinking about the ways that age and gender and geography really play a pivotal role in how we communicate information and what those conversations actually consist of. One other thing that I think really became front of mind is we've worked in the area of investigating sexual violence crimes for a really long time at the Human Rights Center. And so beginning to look at the utility of online open source investigations and what kinds of crimes were even being investigated with these methodologies. There's a lot of emphasis in the space on these very visual, you know, large atrocities, things like bombs going off or buildings being collapsed, or things like what you were talking about with January 6th, where you've got this very dramatic visual footage. But what about the stuff that's maybe not quite as visual? And yet, I think we were really concerned about how some of the hardest crimes to investigate already, like rape and sexual violence, which often can be heavily stigmatized, how you can actually get at that kind of information in these online spaces. And I think that's kind of prompted a whole line of inquiry. And then I think, of course, too, that kind of began to bring us to what are these blind spots? So in the work that the two of you have been doing with interviewing people around the world and some of what's gone into some of our recent research collectively, really looking at the ways that machines create blind spots and the ways that our own human brains create blind spots. So thinking about machines, how algorithms prioritize what we have access to and what we see is a big piece of it. I think Paul Myers, who of course is an online open source investigator who we've done quite a bit with at the Human Rights Center and are quite grateful for, he has this great example of how if you type in Paris Hilton into a browser versus Hilton Paris, how you're going to get very different kinds of results. So even just thinking about the ways that the order of language and how computers think can really mediate what we get to see and what we interact with. And then on the human side, the cognitive biases, how we process information becomes a big part of what we perceive, what we think is important, and what we even notice. I had worked teaching a class of psychology of law before I ever got into the online open source investigation space. And one thing that had really jumped out to me from that literature was how people can look at a videotape of a particular event. And depending on where the angle is of the camera, how you can perceive very differently who is actually the perpetrator in a situation, who's guilty, who's innocent, and that really can affect our emotional reaction to material, which can then affect our cognitive or kind of the logic that we put on top of that. And then of course, issues of confirmation bias, which I think is one of the biggest human biases that we often bring to this work, is we want a certain conclusion. And so we're looking for the information that feeds that conclusion versus figuring out how we step back and bring a little more objectivity to the work.
And I guess, you know, unintentionally, it's something we're probably guilty of as human rights investigators too, you know, as we think like there's a wrong here that we're trying to get at. I think that that those two buckets, kind of the machine and the human bias, are a really helpful way of looking at it. I remember Yvonne talking about the number of different forms of biases a while ago, and I think it was over 1,000, which is far too many to comprehend. But those two components are a really good way of thinking.
And, you know, it's quite frightening once you start thinking about it and you have that little bit of knowledge as to what bias is. You suddenly realize that as humans, we're just big bags of biases. But I suppose what is a bias? Only basically a shortcut, that whether it's, you know, you've seen something and your brain has told you, oh, that fits with something I thought already, or your brain finds it more convincing because you visually perceived it rather than read it. So I think in a sense, it's, yeah, as I said, it's quite sort of overwhelming once you get into the different types of biases that can impact our decision making. But just being aware of them, I think, is a massive step, actually, and just always knowing about them and having them in the back of your mind when you're doing this kind of work is so important.
Well, I guess that's a very nice segue into thinking through some examples so we don't get overwhelmed. I think it's probably helpful, or it's maybe helpful for me, to think of it through in terms of biases in maybe in the discovery process and then in the actual analysis of information. So if we think about discovery, do you have kind of examples of where biases might creep in there, either, I guess, in the machine context or a human context?
Maybe I can give one from the human context, just from the work on looking at issues of open source investigations and sexual violence, which a researcher, Ulrich Egan, and I have been trying to dive into ever more deeply because it's a fascinating area to study, and I think an important one for ultimately helping to get justice for some of these crimes. But one thing that kept coming up in that space, besides the gendered differentials and uses of technology, et cetera, was really how when you're talking about highly stigmatized crimes or crimes that do have a lot of stigma attached to them, like things like rape and other forms of sexual violence, a lot of times the language that's used is very coded. I think we saw that with January 6th as well, when you're talking about alt-right groups or any kind of social group where you're trying not to really broadcast to a wide public what it is you're doing and what you're talking about, but do want to share that information a little bit more intimately with others who may be found online. And so an example from sexual violence, we were interviewing one longtime investigator, and she was talking about her work in trafficking cases and how there was this terminology among traffickers that would change very rapidly. And so they would often talk about trafficking in persons as go get a key or get a cup of coffee. And if you were an investigator trying to investigate these crimes, you needed to be keeping up with how language was utilized, what words were supplanting words for women, for sale, et cetera. And I think one possibility to help us as investigators maybe deal with some of the rapidly changing language and the coded language is to really make sure that we're always creating lexicons when we're doing our investigations and spending some careful time really understanding how people are communicating and what terminology they're using. And then to make sure that we're bringing those hashtags or those phrases into the very structure of our investigation. And I think that also requires really partnering with others who have different expertise than us. I think one of the most exciting things right now about online open source investigations is it can be very multidisciplinary and very collaborative. I'd love to see, in the case of sexual violence investigations, more gender experts working on people who have the technical know-how of how to find this information and take just the brilliant work that they both do and bring it together to have greater impact.
Yeah.
Sorry, Yvonne.
Well, just kind of to add to that, I guess, on the technical side of things then for the discovery of information, one thing that really struck me was in the literature on technical biases, there's a form called Emergent Bias, which is where the technology is used for a purpose that it was never designed to do. And I think we definitely see that in this space where, you know, social media platforms, no, I don't expect that their creators ever envisaged that they could have become these accidental archives of human rights evidence. But that's effectively what they've become. And that has big impact then in terms of how material is tagged, how their search functions work, and what investigators get to see. So we had this example in our article about, you know, if you've got ordinary people who are witnessing things and then posting the video online, the caption they might give it will be very different to the sort of formal legal classification that might be helpful for an investigator. And that's completely normal and to be expected. But again, as Alexa said, when talking about the coded language that people can use for sexual violence, it's just about being mindful of this when conducting searches.
Both of those are really interesting examples, I think, because one is almost related to your own, a very traditional form of bias, I guess, in the sense that it's your own knowledge base. You know, you're unaware of what you don't know, and so you can't see evidence of, you know, perpetrators speaking in front of you. And then the other, I guess, is a more infrastructure-based bias, which is something probably well, I was going to say completely new, but maybe you had it with a library index card years ago or something, but you know, a very modern form of change. Maybe we'll move on to the idea of what the analysis of information, because I think that's where, you know, that's probably what most people think of when they think of a human rights investigation, not, you know, the trawling through thousands of documents. It's analyzing and trying to build a case.
I remember the first time that really struck me, just how much bias could creep into online open source investigations, as we were in I think the first year of the investigations lab at the Human Rights Center, and a student got up and was presenting on geolocation she'd done of a particular attack on a mosque. And she was very confident in terms of having located the right mosque in the right city in Syria, et cetera. And another student got up and said, I found a very different mosque, and could we kind of work on this? And it was very eye-opening to see how easily, when we begin to see patterns that fit our ideas of where something is or what something is, how we map that on. I think there's a bias called the anchoring effect, where the first interpretation you have of something, or the first hypothesis you have of something, will often be the hypothesis that grounds you in the way that you look at all the information that comes later. And so one of the things we began to do was have to partner up students so that they could be challenging each other on their own interpretation of events to try and mitigate some of the impact of these biases. But again, that's of course really tricky to overcome.
Well, I think it's even tricky at a practical level now. You know, it's something we're finding just because of remote working. You know, how do you ensure that people can buddy up in a way that used to be very, very straightforward when we booked out a room for a couple of hours and everybody came. Yvonne, what do you think, I guess, about then maybe the biases that are introduced through automation?
Yeah, so this was something we talk about in the article, how so increasingly there are different tools brought out there to help investigators filter content. And this is really useful and important because, I mean, we're talking about millions of pieces of content here. So, but as Alexa and Udic have pointed out in their research, a lot of these tend to be already tilted towards the detection of things like particular types of munitions or maybe tear gas canisters. And Alexa and Udic have written that there's a risk that this will sort of turn the investigator's gaze towards this particular type of violation, like I can't remember the exact term you used, Alexa, like shiny objects, basically. So there's that. And I guess then even, you know, as you think about automation, the biases that can be inherent in that. So let's say you've got an investigator using facial recognition, a facial recognition tool to match, do we have this perpetrator in our collection of images? Well, you know, as you've found, Daragh, in your research on facial recognition, there's an awful lot of bias inherent in that. These algorithms tend to be trained on data sets of Hollywood celebrities, or, you know, and so they're less able at picking up different categories of individuals who tend to be underrepresented in those data sets.
I think the other thing I might add to that is, you know, I think all the social science research suggests that certainty and accuracy are often not correlated. And so when we're talking about visual information in particular, our brain wants to make connections between disparate bits of data. So, you know, if the machine spits out, this is X person based on our facial recognition technology, that can very much influence our interpretation of whether it is, because we're actually not very good at processing visual information as humans. And yet we have a high degree of reliance on and certainty that what we see is what is in the world. And I think just even opening our awareness to just how our high level certainty and our accuracy are often really at different spots is an important thing for investigators to really take to heart. And it's a little humbling, and I think a little overwhelming to sometimes think about just how bad we are at visual analysis, especially if we don't have professional training in that space.
Yeah, interesting. I have two kind of questions to wrap things up, I guess. The first is what with these forms of biases, are they different to things that have existed before, or are they just, a slightly different wrapping on something that has been a part of human rights investigations for a long time? And the second then is, what can we do about them? So in the interests of, making sure that a human rights investigation, particularly, into a situation, is as comprehensive as possible and really documents all of the human rights, incidents, I guess, that are happening there. How can we help to overcome these biases or potential biases?
If you're happy, Alexa, I might answer or talk about the first question if you want to talk about the second. Is that? Yeah. So on the first, how new is this problem? I think it's probably like a new face on the node problem, in that, there have always been gaps in information that can be gathered. There have always been difficulties in terms of gathering information on particular types of violations or reaching less accessible parts of the world. But I think there are some aspects of it that are quite new. So I think the algorithmic bias thing is quite new. I think stuff around, as Alexa said at the outset, about what search results you get and being aware of that's something that's quite new, compared to the old days when you might go maybe look in an archive for documentary evidence, or you talk to witnesses. So I think it's probably a new face on the node problem with some aspects that are actually quite unique.
And in terms of what we can do about it, I do think being aware of the different kinds of biases, the scope of those biases, and how they do actually affect every single one of us, despite our best efforts, is really important. I do think a lot of the research that has been established suggests that awareness isn't enough. So one thing that I do think from the scientific community has proven to be helpful in any area where you need to be somewhat objective in whatever kind of work you're doing, whether it's medicine and being a doctor, or it's being an online open source investigator, is to establish some form of protocol that makes your work as systematic as possible, to try and remove some of the human emotion and interpretation pieces out of this, and to really carefully go through that checklist. So, in terms of what we do at the Human Rights Center, but also what I think has become a norm in the field more generally, it's to create some kind of digital landscape analysis first, so to really think through the planning process of your investigation, to make sure you've done the analytics of who's speaking where and about what. And are you missing categories of people who might have been impacted by a particular event, so that you look elsewhere or think a little bit more creatively in terms of how you're going to go about that open source investigation. A second part is, of course, creating some kind of investigation plan. And I think that encompasses a broad array of things, many of which don't have to do directly with bias, but can still help with bias. So thinking through the security aspects of this, the resiliency, psychological aspects of this work, and really crafting a plan that you think is going to get you the most information from the broadest range of people in the best amount of time. As part of that, I do think building into any of those plans is taking things like a gender analysis or an ethnicity analysis, and really making sure that you've consciously integrated that thinking about disparate voices and underrepresented populations as part of how you're going to approach this. And then as a check on the actual analytical work, making sure that you engage in multiple working hypotheses. So if you have one theory of your case, can you generate other theories of the case, or what a defense team, for example, might throw at you and present as an alternate theory, and really test those alternate theories against the information that you've collected to see if one of those is as viable or perhaps more viable than the original hypothesis you started out with. Peer review, I think, is a really important part of this as well. So sending it out to peers in the field and who might have very different perspectives, and saying, are you reaching the same conclusions? Are you reaching a very different perspective on this? And at every step along the way, really beginning to test and be very analytical, and even chart the findings that you have, so that you can visually see, wait, I thought what I was finding was X, but really the weight of the content seems to be on Y, and I need to think about that a little bit more systematically and carefully. So I think in the Berkeley Protocol on Digital Open Source Investigations, which was launched by the UN Human Rights Office earlier this year, that Berkeley helped with, but was informed by, I think, over 150 practitioners. There were multiple working groups, some of which we did with you guys. All of your work on ethics in this space for the two of you has really fed into some of what ended up in that protocol. But I do think there are some helpful annexes there to help structure investigations to try and minimize some of the impact of what we're seeing.
And Alexa, you had a really good example in our article about the 3 steps. So like the first is the sort of the technical, so, you know, is there any metadata? The second is like the content. So like, can we geolocate this? Do we hear voices that tell us it seems to be from this part of the world by the language they're speaking and the accents? And the third is the source analysis. So who is this? Where did this piece of content come from? Has this person posted similar content before? Is there anything on their account that suggests that, you know, maybe they've got a particular perspective, or they're they're seeking to put out a certain viewpoint? And you had this really good example of the Syrian Hero Boy.
Yeah, so Lindsay Freeman, I have to credit her. She's been pulling together a lot of the trainings that we've been offering at the Human Rights Center, and she did a great job, I thought, of really breaking out that one way to check against wrong conclusions about visual information like videos and photographs posted to social media is to make sure you systematically go through those 3 steps of analysis for every piece of content that you're going to rely upon. In the Syrian Hero Boy situation, there was a video that became quite broadly famous and was put out by a lot of media that claimed to be of a young boy in Syria rescuing a young girl under gunfire, basically. And it was titled Syrian Hero Boy. It derived a lot of attention as sort of this message of hope and possibility in the middle of this very upsetting conflict. And the media, one of the things that she was finding and kind of analyzing that particular video is that the people who put it out publicly were often those who did content analysis. So did what a lot of us do in the space, which was analyze the buildings and analyze the color of the soil and the patterns of the sidewalk, et cetera. And the determination that was made by one BBC reporter was that this was probably Aleppo. It was certainly Syria. But what many of us now, all of us now know, is that this was actually a staged event on the film set of The Gladiator in Malta. So it wasn't even Syria. And what she often talks about is how the people who declined actually pushing this out more broadly to the world were the ones who went, wait a second, who's the source of this video and what are their potential motivations for putting this up? I think Sam Dubberly at Amnesty is really good at driving that point home as well. And when they couldn't find out more about the source, they're like, this is a little too shady. Why would we have someone allegedly from Syria post one video? They don't have a whole portfolio of these things, and we can't even really figure out who this person is. And their instincts on that front were right. So I do think it's a really good lesson or example of how important it is to be systematic in our analysis.
Thanks so much to both of you. I think, you know, for me, it's also, it's indicative, I guess, of a really interesting time with open source investigations, where we've moved from this idea that this is something new and it's a tool, you know, what can we do with it? And everyone's experimenting to, I don't want to say professionalization, but more of there's more rigor, I guess. So we're thinking through all of these different components, and it's a very exciting time, I guess, in the sense that it's an entirely new human rights or form of human rights investigative technique that's coming into its own, and with massive credit to both of you for driving it on. I think
I'm so grateful for both of you including me in the research that you've been doing, and I think the interviews that you've been using to kind of pull together this community.
You're the boss, Alexa. But thanks a million to you both. And I guess for anybody watching, if you have any questions, please go to any of our respective websites, drop us a line, and we're available for parties.